Mr. Hamm, welcome to Bayonne High School, and I got to say, number one, when I was asked to interview you, right, by Mr. Bird,
Yes.
I was very thrilled.
Okay.
Being at the Freedom Fund dinner,
Yes.
you know, you were here the whole time,
Oh,
and
man.
and to be at that level shows not only your passion for your beliefs and what you stand for, but just who you are as a person. And I was telling my students the other day, when I was telling them I was interviewing you, so someone popped in before. I told them, like, it was like sitting in my classroom. It's like what I do in 180 days you did in that hour talk. And I just, it felt so good to hear that, because as an educator of African American history and Holocaust and human rights, it's what makes me feel good when I hear other people talking about it, because then I know I'm doing the right thing.
Right.
So for me, it's an absolute real honor to be here and get to interview
Well,
and
no,
chat it up.
The pleasure is mine, and I'm glad to be here. And that was a great evening at the Bayonne NAACP Freedom Fund dinner. That was a great evening.
It was, again, for me, really, really special. So I want to start it off with, and we were talking beforehand, so some of my questions, I'm like, oh, okay, well, that works, and then kind of blend some stuff in. But when did you realize that you wanted to be an activist?
Well, it didn't start out with me wanting to be an activist. It was something I was thrust into. I mean, I had a really normal childhood. I did not come from a family of political activists. I was a child, so I'm not privy to all the conversations that were in our household, but I never heard a lot of discussion about politics, even civil rights, even though at the time I was, old enough to understand what people were talking about. In my house, there wasn't a lot of talk about it. So what happened was, I went to high school, I went to arts high school, and was pretty much on a regular course, but I was active in high school. I ran track, I ran cross country, I did other sports, and eventually I ended up being the head of the student council at Arts High School in Newark. And in 1971, there was a teacher strike in 1971. I think up until that time, it was the longest teacher strike in the history of the United States. And the concern was, at one point, we were told as students that we might not graduate because the rule was that if you missed 35 consecutive days of school, you weren't supposed to graduate. Now, I was a senior, all my friends were seniors. Up until that time, the student council wasn't really dealing with any heavy issues. All of a sudden, everybody comes to me like, Larry, what are you going to do about this? We're not going, because we had all applied to colleges. I applied to 3 colleges, Princeton, Harvard, Yale. I was accepted at all 3 colleges. We were ready to go, and all of a sudden, we were getting word that we might not graduate. So in March of my senior year, March of 1971, we organized a walkout, a march, and a sit-in. I don't know if everyone in the audience knows Newark that well, but across the street from Newark Penn Station is a hotel. Today it's called the Doubletree Hotel. Then it was called the Gateway Hotel. And the board and the union were meeting down there, and we marched down there. Most of my school participated in the walkout. About 400 of us marched downtown. About 200 of us got into the hotel, and we sat in. And then the mayor showed up. He, remember Newark had an uprising, a rebellion, just 4 years prior, 1967. And, the city was very sensitive about social disturbances. And so the mayor was like, look, you guys understand what you're doing. I think it's good. You're very concerned about your education. If you leave, I will take your demands and make sure, because we had a list of demands too, and I'll make sure your demands are dealt with. So we left. And then about 2 months after that, almost 2 or 3 weeks before I was ready to graduate, the mayor asked me if I wanted to be a member of the Newark Board of Education. Now, this wasn't as a student representative. The Newark Board has 9 members. At that time, it was an appointed board, not an elected board. Today, it's an elected board, but then it was appointed. And at the age of 17, he asked me, and I wasn't, to be truthful, I wasn't like super gung-ho about it. I knew it would be a great honor, but I was looking forward to going to college and everything. But I said yes. And on July 1st, 1971, I was sworn in as the youngest fully empowered voting board member in the history of the United States. And I still think I hold that record because I wasn't even old enough to vote. At that time, you had to be 18 years old to vote. And so I was appointed to the school board. And that's really the beginning of my journey down the path of social activism. Shortly after I was appointed to the board, I had been nominated for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference Youth Award. Now, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was the organization of Dr. Martin Luther King, and they flew me down to New Orleans for their convention, and I received that award from the hands of Coretta Scott King. And at that time, I met just about all the civil rights leaders that were still alive, except Dr. King, who had been assassinated. Jesse Jackson, Andrew Young, Ralph Abernathy, Hosea Williams, they were all there at the SCLC convention. So that also, oriented me. And then shortly after that, I met the poet, playwright, activist who has since joined the Ancestors. He passed away in 2014, Amiri Baraka. And he had a profound influence on my political thinking. So my term on the board was 3 years, and it was difficult because, no one was like oblivious to what a burden this would be, but they assured me, they said, you will be able to do your work as a school board member and as a student at Princeton. And so I get to Princeton, and it was very difficult. We were having the school system was in an uproar. So we were having school board meetings, 2 and 3 school board meetings a week, because it wasn't just the regular monthly board meeting. A board meeting sits on committees, building grounds and supplies, personnel, curriculum, and they would send a car for me, and I was coming back to Newark like every other day. And so I had to withdraw from Princeton. I withdrew at the end of October of 1971 because it was impossible for me to do both. If I had stayed there, I probably wouldn't have graduated from Princeton. So I withdrew, and I served my 3 years on the board, and that kind of propelled me into national politics and students can go and look it up. If you go on I don't know what they have these days. We used to have microfiche and microfilm. I don't know if they still, but if you Google Larry Hamm, if you go back far enough, you'll see that when I was appointed to the board, it was like national news with front page, New York Times, Star Ledger, and on and on. But I had to withdraw from school, and I came back home and really served as like a full-time board member for those 3 years. And then I returned to Princeton. And it was very interesting because when I left Princeton, it was almost as big a deal as when I was appointed to the school board. Imagine you're the youngest school board member, you're praised in the newspaper one day, and then a couple of months later, school board member drops out of Princeton. Those were like the headlines, And my poor mother, she was like, Larry, what are you doing with your life? And
she knew, right?
well, I don't know. All she knew was is that her son, who had gotten thrown out of school in the 8th grade, got a chance to go to Princeton University and graduate, and now he was leaving Princeton University. But I served my 3 years on the board, and I returned to Princeton. And I graduated from Princeton cum laude 4 years later in 1978. But while I was at Princeton, you know, the struggle to free the black people of South Africa from apartheid was in full swing, and there was a national student movement. So I helped to organize the anti-apartheid movement on Princeton's campus. And so just like we sat in 1971, I organized a sit-in at Princeton.
So I had the chant, Princeton divest, oh yeah, just like the rest, oh yeah. And I
That's
wrote
right.
for that, you know, when you hear those words,
Right.
what were you thinking? What do you think?
Well, I thought about that whole period, and it's interesting because when we first started out this campaign, and this is something that, you know, young people who get in politics should understand, most struggles are protracted struggles, and struggles for social justice initially are not popular. It's not popular to stand up for justice. It's not popular to fight for justice because you got to shake things up. And people like to be comfortable, people like routine, people like the status quo, and you want to come in and shake things up. People don't like that. And so, you know, people see Larry Hamm when he was appointed to the school board, and wow, right? But they don't see all that grief I had when I was trying to go to school and trying to do the school board thing, or all the grief when I left school to do the term on the school board, or even with the anti-apartheid thing. When we first started, if we were lucky to get 12 students in a meeting, you know, and when we had protests, you know, it might be a few dozen students. So that campaign was 4 years. The chant that you just mentioned was in our senior year. But by our senior year, that movement, which had been a handful of people, was now a campus-wide movement with broad campus support, with support from faculty, with support from outside the campus. They said we had the largest demonstrations since the Vietnam War era, since the anti-Vietnam War protests that were at Princeton. And so in 1978, we organized a sit-in at Nassau Hall. That's that building you see when you see pictures of Princeton's campus. You see this nice colonial-looking building. That's actually a national monument. It was actually the first headquarters of the Revolutionary Continental Army under George Washington. But we took that building over in 1978, and as a result, Princeton took its funds out of a few companies that did business with South Africa. But movements take time to build, and they are not popular initially. So if anyone is thinking about being an activist, you know, if you think that's going to make you more popular, you know, for a long time, that's not going to be true. You don't become popular until you begin to win people over to your point of view. And this is one of the things I want to mention too. When I was at Princeton, you know, you had certain requirements, certain courses that you had to take, certain courses that were elective. And I took public speaking when I was at Princeton, but now I wish I had taken debate. Because public speaking is really easy. I mean, once you get past the self-conscious, you know, I don't want to, I'm scared, you know, once you get past that, because you're presenting a point of view. But in real life, people debate ideas. If I approach you today and I say, well, we really have to do something about police. We have to change the way policing is done in America. Initially, you might not like that idea, and you're gonna indicate that to me, and then I'm in a position where I need to persuade you to my point of view, and that's what debating does. And that's why I'm glad to see that, you know, we have debate in a number of high schools, because in real life, politics is about convincing and persuading people to your point of view. And it's very difficult around social justice issues because people learn to, in 100 different ways, people learn to accept the status quo, either consciously or unconsciously. I'm sorry.
No, because I'm thinking you're not going, like, you're fueling what, so outside of this is fueling me as an educator, but also as an activist myself in the things that I do, because again, it's not easy. And that's one of the things that I try to help my students understand when they're getting to that level. And I'm glad that your voice is, getting there too, because sometimes when it comes from me, it's like, okay, but when I hear it from somebody as prominent as you, it's like, okay, it makes sense. Because even when you look at Dr. King or you look at Malcolm X, their views are not, even though today people, there are a lot of people who go, oh, Dr. King, we loved him, everybody loved him. We know that's not true. Right. If you study that history, you understand it.
That's right.
And you look at the bricks that are chucked at him, the rocks that are chucked at him, his movement wasn't popular.
Right.
It becomes popular later,
right.
But it's about building that momentum, and it's having that, fortitude to keep moving forward.
That's right.
With that handful like you spoke about at Princeton, like you have to get people moving in that direction.
Right.
So like when you're talking about that, and it just reminded me of something I wanted to ask, because you mentioned about Jesse Jackson and flying down for the award there. And I know that you worked with him with the Rainbow Coalition.
Yes.
So I was interested in talking about that because, again, building movements.
Right.
When you look at Fred Hampton, putting the Rainbow Coalition together, it was about unifying all people. Same with Dr. King.
Right.
He becomes the biggest threat to the country when he unifies all people, especially the middle class and the poor, to figure out what's going on. So, how important was the Rainbow Coalition for you? And, how could such a group benefit our state today or even our country today?
Well, American politics is coalition politics. If you're trying to change national policies and national laws, eventually you're going to come to a point where you have to realize that in your particular group or your particular demographic, you don't have enough compelling power. Politics is about power. It's about the ability to compel people to do what it is you want them to do. And if I say power, it's kind of abstract. But if I say influence, you might grasp that a little bit better. Influence people, you want to convince people, like Dr. King had to convince people that the whole set of laws that existed in this country up until the mid-1960s that legally kept black people and white people separate was wrong. He had to convince, now initially, first he had to build power in the group of the people most affected by this. Because when you're trying to build power, you have to say, okay, who is most ready to do this thing that I want them to do? So the first line are the people who are actually affected. So black people were the people most negatively affected by legal segregation. So he had to build his movement there first. But to change the laws, eventually, he couldn't even do it just on the stage of Alabama, of Montgomery, Alabama. He had to move nationally to Congress. So eventually, the civil rights movement had to have allies outside of the black community. And this has always been true. And it really depends a lot on where you get on the train. Like a train is going, right, and the train stops in Newark and New York and it's like where you get on the train. So if you get on the train in 1957, you're going to see Dr. King working mostly with black people. And if you get on the train in 1619, you're going to see mostly black people enslaved. But to abolish slavery, there had to be allies who were not slaves, and there were, and that's one part of history that is not given enough attention, because if we study slavery in high school, black people were enslaved, there was a civil war, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation, and it's done. But you don't see that slavery lasted 400 years. really 500 years if you count from the time that Columbus came to the Western Hemisphere, because that was the advent, the beginning of slavery in the Western Hemisphere. So you don't see all the work, you don't see the work of the abolitionist movement. You don't see the work of the Quakers, who were the initial denomination that were opposed to slavery. And it's the same in the civil rights movement. You step in 1956, Dr. King's doing the Montgomery bus boycott, you see black people. But to get from Montgomery in 1955, 56 to the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, Dr. King had to get other allies, and that there were many white supporters of the civil rights movement. This is something that people really have to grasp, because I grew up in Newark, New Jersey. I grew up in an all-black community. My universe was black, except when I went to school. That was the only time I came into contact with white people, because when I went to school, we didn't have black teachers or administrators. So the white world was over here and the black world was over here, and we're insulated. And at a certain point, if you're trying to build compelling power, you have to maintain the base of the people who are most affected, because they're going to go the whole way with you. But you have to have allies to increase your power, so you can compel Congress to do what it is, to abolish Jim Crow, or to compel the Supreme Court, or to compel the president. And this is what power is. If you want to change something in the school, you just can't have the kids in your homeroom. You got to go get your class, you got to get all the seniors, and eventually you got to get half of the school probably to sign a petition to get something changed in the school. That's power, when you can influence people beyond your insular world and get people to work together on a common goal. And so the Rainbow Coalition was very important. You mentioned Fred Hampton. The idea of the Rainbow Coalition is first, I believe, enunciated by Fred Hampton, because even the Black Panther Party, remember, Fred Hampton was the chairman of the Black Panther Party. Now, it speaks for itself, the Black Panther Party. So everybody say, well, they're just about black people. But if you read about, that's right, if you read the 10-point program, or you read Huey Newton's Revolutionary Suicide or Die for the People, you will see that even the Black Panther Party understood at a certain point that they had to build a coalition. What they called it was the United Front Against Fascism. And Fred Hampton called it a Rainbow Coalition, because he said he wanted to get the poor people, the poor black people, the poor Latinos, the poor whites, everybody get together and build a coalition. And so Martin Luther King, same thing. If you read Dr. King's book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? He said in 1968, we're going to have a poor people's movement. We're going to bring the poor people, these are his words, we're going to bring the Negroes from the ghettos, the Latinos from the barrios, the Native Americans from the reservations, and the poor whites from Appalachia. We're going to march on Washington and engage in massive civil disobedience until Congress does what? Pass an economic bill of rights, free health care for all, free education, college for all, a living wage for all, an end to war, etc., etc. And then Jesse Jackson comes in, he's going to run for president. If black people are only 14% of the American population, you can't get elected president with just black people. You got to get black people, white people, red people, yellow people, brown people, and so on and so forth. So he built the Rainbow Coalition. Now, Jesse Jackson was not successful. He did not win the presidency, but by him running for president, with the changes that came about from that, because he changed some things in the political system that enabled Barack Obama to be elected president. If there had been no Jesse Jackson running for president in 1984 and 1988, no Rainbow Coalition, Barack Obama would have never become president. And that's another thing about social change. Most times, not sometimes, most times, the people who fight for the change may not be the beneficiaries of that change. So in fact, you're fighting for people who you don't even know, who will end up benefiting from your work.
This is a conversation I had with my students the other day, because there's a message that I relay to my students, and I do it with my union work as well. There's a story of Tycho Brahe. I won't go into it, but it's about building a legacy. Mm-hmm. And many times what we do as activists, as educators, as people in the community, we don't always get to see what we fought for. We don't see it come to fruition, but we do it because we know it's going to benefit those who come after us.
That's right.
So I didn't have that as a question, but I would talk about that right there with you.
Well, I think
see that.
I think this is the most honorable part of being an activist. And it's unconscious. I don't think anyone does it consciously. It's selflessness. You know, you're fighting for something and you may not actually benefit that thing. That's like the highest form of morality. You know, that's really one of the things that makes us human. That you would protect someone who could not protect themselves. You will help someone who could not help themselves. People say, well, what made you become a political activist? Even though my mother was not a political activist, the foundational values that she gave me to treat people the way I would want to be treated, to treat people fairly, those are values that lay the foundation for you to engage in political work to help people that you won't even know. And this is one of the things that makes us human. Because if we didn't have that, we wouldn't be much different from animals. It would be the survival of the fittest. And we wouldn't care that people are oppressed. You weak, you die. The weak die. The strong prevail. You know, the rich prosper, the poor people suffer. That's the way the world is. You should accept that. But humanity, no. Humanity dictates that we help the weak. We protect those who are defenseless. That we try to eliminate poverty. That we try to eliminate war. That we try to have education for everybody. You know, that's what makes us human. And that's really one of the things, you know, people, to be truthful, I have children. I have children, right? I have never said to my children, I want you to be political activists. You know why? Because the life is so hard that I would not force my children to do it. Now, if my children, who are all adults, they're grown, 3 young women, of which I'm very proud, all college graduates, if they choose that road, then I will give them all the support I can. But it's a hard road. People don't know Dr. King was arrested 39 times. Who's arrested 39 times? He was arrested so much his kids would say, Daddy, why you go to jail so much? We know that he was assassinated, but there were multiple attempts on Dr. King's life. You know, we see the Dr. King giving the I Have a Dream speech. We don't see the night that he had the rally to start, December the 5th, to start the Montgomery bus boycott. They bombed his house. His wife and children were in the house. How many wives would countenance? Martin, you're doing stuff that's going to get us all killed. That's why you can't really talk about Dr. King and not talk about Coretta Scott King and not talk about the women that were in the civil rights movement, because She could have gone in another direction. She said, you continue to, I'm going to leave you, I'm going. You're not going to get us killed. But she said, no, I'm going to be side by side with you in this fight. And she was a leader in her own right. All the benefits that we have today, all of them, notwithstanding, every benefit, every social benefit that we have in this country today, people that you don't know had to struggle for. Free public schools. Most people don't know free public schools were a product of the movement to abolish slavery. When the Reconstruction governments, those are the state governments that came into being after black people got citizenship and the right to vote, one of the first things they did was to establish free public schools as we know them today. For everybody. They didn't say free public schools for the children of the people who were enslaved. No, they said we're going to establish free public schools for everybody. 8-hour workday, unemployment insurance, Social Security, Medicare, free public schools, financial aid for college. All of these things were struggled for. Nobody in power came to a meeting one day and said, oh, I think we should let our workers have the right to have a union. No, people had to fight for the right to have a union. A. Philip Randolph. But even before A. Philip Randolph, the people in the 19th century who were fighting for 8, 8, and 8. 8 hours of work, 8 hours of sleep, and 8 hours of recreation. That was a 19th century concept. And it was a struggle other than the struggle for slavery. But many people don't know, in the early labor movement, black people were involved there. Very involved. They were at Haymarket Square when the people were killed demonstrating for an 8-hour workday. So this is an important concept to understand, that all the beneficial things we have in society came about because somebody struggled. You know, in some cases it was black people, in some cases it was white people, in some cases it was Latinos, in some cases it was Asian Americans. I remember when I got to Princeton, I told you I grew up in a very insular world, right? When I got to Princeton, I had to take a course. And in this course, we had to read a 2-volume work called To Serve the Devil. And I believe the author was Paul Jacob. And all I knew was Newark. And all I knew was the black-white paradigm, that white people had everything good in society and black people had everything bad in society. I didn't know about the struggles of other ethnic groups. And when I read this book, To Serve the Devil, each chapter was about a different ethnic group that had to, like, there was discrimination against Irish people. When Irish people got here, there was discrimination against Italians. Italians were not even considered white initially when they got here. Italians and other Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans. You know, I didn't know that the Asians, the role that the Chinese played in building the railroads and the terrible working conditions that they had to endure. You know, I didn't know that other peoples, also, I didn't know about Jewish people and what they went through. I mean, you know, they mentioned the Holocaust to me when I took social studies, but that was in Europe. I didn't know that Jews faced discrimination here in this country. Many changed their names so that they would sound more American, so they could be accepted. There were country clubs and other things that discriminated against Jewish people.
That's why you saw like a really close link during the civil rights era
Between Jews and blacks. That's right.
It's like the third wave for me.
That's right.
So that natural migration towards each other to support.
That's right. So this is what education does. It broadens your perspective, you know. I didn't know all these things, and through education, I was able, and by knowing that, it deepened my sense of empathy and sympathy. Where empathy is also a part. When you feel the suffering of other people, it also compels you. I mean, we're not just driven by power. You know, Che Guevara was a a revolutionary in Cuba, in the Cuban Revolution. And one of the quotes I'll never forget from Che was, revolutionaries are motivated by true feelings of love, you know? And that stuck with me. And the other day I was in a protest where a pastor got up and he made a quote, and he quoted Dr. King, who he said that I choose love because hate is too heavy a burden to bear.
We had this conversation in my class and before about bearing the burdens and holding on to that stuff. So you just reminded me of that, because I think about trying to move forward and look at where we are now. And, you know, sometimes we don't learn from the past. People say, you know, history rhymes, but history repeats itself. And I think of it more as rhyming.
Yeah.
Because it's not same place, same people, different time, different space, different people, but the things are connected. So when we look at the Black Lives Matter movement right now, how do you see the connections between the eras of the 50s and the 60s?
Well, the Black Lives Matter movement is a wonderful movement. I mean, I love the Black Lives Matter movement because it pulls so many young people into the struggle. You know, there were massive demonstrations, many of them, not all of them, but many of them organized by Black Lives Matter. You know, there were millions of people who participated in the protests to demand justice for George Floyd, not just in the United States, but all around the world. I saw an article that was in the Star Ledger that said there were protests in 157 towns and cities in New Jersey. I was amazed by this. If you had told me that there was going to be a Black Lives Matter protest in Clifton, I would have said, you know, you making that up. You in Belleville, you making that up, but there were. And that's wonderful because it showed that people want justice. You know, because if you were to believe what was on the television and what people were saying on television and what people were saying in the newspapers, you would think that people don't care. You would even think that the majority of people were against what Black Lives Matter was for. But many times you'll find that the majority of people are actually in favor of what people are fighting for. It's just that a lot of people don't come out. And this is the other thing you have to understand, that social movements and revolutions are made by a smaller part of the population. Some historians say that only 10% of the American colonists supported the American Revolution. At the time, you know, that's a small group that was not very popular. You know, and there were towns that were pro-Tory. The Tories supported the British, you know, and the other people, the Whigs, I guess, and other people supported the revolution, but it did not have the majority of support. But, you know, people wanted to be free of British oppression at that time. And this is true for all social movements, that the people who actually engage in the struggle are a minority. If you wake up one morning, if you expect to wake up one morning and all of a sudden everybody is going to be in support of what you're doing, you're dreaming. That's called idealism, you know, and idealism will lead you to depression and nervous breakdown. You know, there's not going to be no great day when everybody wakes up at the same time and we all go arm in arm toward the New Jerusalem. It don't work like that. It's a fight, it's a struggle. You have to convince people of your arguments. You have to march through the system. You got to go through city council meetings and school board meetings and state committee hearings and congressional committee hearings and protests and nonviolent civil disobedience, boycotts and voting. It's a whole plethora of activity. You know, it's not just one thing you have to do. You have to use all of the tactics, all of the legal tactics that are available to you. You got to use your dollars for boycotting. You got to use your feet for marching. You got to use your votes in elections. Everything that's available to you to make change. It's almost like a symphony. You know, like here in this school, they have a school band, right? You don't have an orchestra of all tubas. You know, you have tubas, you have trumpets, you have cornets, you have violins, you have cellos, you have violas, you have bass drums, you have snare drums, you know, you have piano, you got all different instruments, but the organizer's role is to make all of those instruments play together for the same cause.
You made me think when you were talking about the movement, and it's not a question I had. Just a few years ago, I was at a NJA event where Brother West spoke, and Cornel West, and he spoke about the idea of woke, and like he's like, man, if you are woke, too woke, you're gonna die of insomnia. You have to be able to take this stuff and bring that. So it made me think of that, and I'll fold it kind of to this. You know, when we think about progress and moving and idealism, we look at Black History Month, and had this conversation with my students today, and they asked me what did I feel about it, and I said, you know, it's kind of funny. I'm going to ask Mr. Hamm that. So, looking at Black History Month, how do you feel about that as the month, and then what do you think could and should be done moving forward? Right? Because my philosophy is, it can't just be a month. You have to infuse Black history throughout everything you do, because Black history is American history. But for me, I like Black history because it's about highlighting too. It's like, hey, look, this is here. But you know, what are your thoughts on Black History Month?
Well, I think Black History Month is wonderful. I think I'm glad to see. Like when I walked in this school today, I passed a Black History Month display. And it made me smile, because that meant that this school was conscious of the fact that young people need to know Black history. Now, why do we have Black history? Years ago, I visited the historian John Henry Clark in his home. And he and I were talking. And he said, the reason we have Black history is because it's been excluded from American history. He said there would not be a need for Black history if they just taught the truth. That's what John Henry Clark said to me in his home on Convent. He's passed away, but I visited him in his home on Convent Avenue in Harlem, New York. So I am old enough, I'm 69 years old. I can remember when there was no Black history. There wasn't even Negro history. And I came along right at the time when there was this awakening. And I'm not going to say the first awakening, because you'll find that throughout history, people have awakenings. Because the pendulum, imagine a big grandfather clock with a pendulum that swings back and forth. The pendulum of history swings back and forth. And you'll have periods where people become awake. That's hence the term woke. People wake up to a certain injustice and they take action. But what you learn is that once that problem is solved, if people don't remain vigilant, the pendulum will swing backwards. And that the very thing you struggle for can actually be undone. You know, we think when we have these epic fights, like the fight for civil rights and the fight for labor rights and the fight for workers' rights, that once these great struggles take place, it's done. But no, just as you pushed for these things, there are negative forces in society who will push against you. And when you go to sleep, they will push it back to where it was. And that's what we're going through right now. DeSantis in Florida. Black History Month was started by Carter G. Woodson. And Carter G. Woodson wrote a book called The Miseducation of the Negro. Carter G. Woodson was the second African American to graduate from Harvard University. The first African American to graduate, not graduate, but to get a PhD from Harvard University. The first person to get a PhD was Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, which I hope young people will also familiarize themselves with. But Carter G. Woodson got his doctorate in history, I believe, around 1912. And he went back home. And at the beginning of the 20th century, a lot of people couldn't read. A lot of people could read, but a lot of people couldn't read because education still wasn't as widespread as it is today. So Carter G. Woodson studied black history at Harvard. He studied African history and the history of African Americans in this country, called, at that time we were called Negroes. And he said, I want to bring this knowledge back to my people. So a lot of people couldn't read. So what he started doing was writing a Negro history column in the black newspaper. And out of that, people couldn't read, so people would take Carter G. Woodson's column to church. And when church service was over, someone who could read would stand up and read Carter G. Woodson's latest column on Negro history. Out of that came the idea for Negro History Week. And then in time, Negro History Week became Negro History Month. And then when we had the Black Consciousness Movement, and we stopped calling ourselves Negro and colored, because that's the era that when I was raised, when I was a little boy, people were saying colored. They weren't even saying Negro. They were saying we colored, you know. But then James Brown, 1967, said, say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud, so we black. And so it became Black History Month. The pioneer in New Jersey was the first black woman ever elected to the state Senate. Her name was Winona Lippman, and she introduced the bill in the New Jersey State Legislature, which officially recognized Black History Month in 1971. And then I think it was actually, I could be wrong, but I think it was actually under President Gerald Ford that Black History Month was nationally recognized. So that's how we got to Black History Month. And Black history is an attempt to make American history whole, to put back the portion that was left out. And so we had to fight for black studies and black history. Before 1966, there was no college black studies program. I believe the first black studies program was established at San Francisco State University in 1966. That's right, through protests. Students were protesting black students were protesting on college campuses all across the country for black studies programs. And that's why we have them. And you know, it's funny because, you know, a lot of people think, well, I got here on my own. No, I can show you pictures of students taking over school buildings to get black history in college campuses. And that's why we have it today. And the same thing is happening with what? Women's history. Black people were excluded, women were excluded, Native Americans were excluded. Like, how many people can actually talk about the history of Native Americans? Like, when did Native Americans become citizens? You know, how many people know that? Like, we all born citizens, but Native Americans were not recognized as citizens until around the 1940s through congressional legislation. I mean, everybody was excluded because it was a white supremacist, a white racist narrative of America. And so all these other histories are the part that's been left out. And the German philosopher Hegel said, the truth is the whole. And so to know the truth, we have to have all of it. So it's good. It's good to have Negro History Month and Women's History Month and Latino History Month. All of these things are good. But in 2003 in New Jersey, a law was passed called the Amistad Act. And even with Black History Month, people still wasn't teaching it. And so they passed a law. It was introduced by Assemblyman William Payne. He's still alive. He lives in Essex County. And they passed the Amistad law. And the Amistad says that black history must be taught in all New Jersey schools. It must be in all social studies curricula. And I believe it also says infused in other part of the curricula. But here we are in 2023, a quarter of the way into the 21st century. And the truth is that only a handful of school districts are actually implementing Amistad. I mean, if they were to do an official audit to see who was doing it, probably 85% of the school districts would be found wanting.
Yeah, and I've been part of that here because I did work with Stephanie Wilson. Years ago, I attended an Amistad program, and then because of the work that I do, I was put on the task force to make sure that everything was being implemented in the district, to make sure we're following the Amistad mandate and the Holocaust mandate, which was great because they come on the heels. You have 94, the Holocaust mandate, making sure that we're educating our students about Holocaust, human rights, biases, racism, and then now you have Amistad coming right behind it and bringing it forward. And I know NJA is been putting a program together to get educators to make this journey through parts of Africa and then come back through the South to bring that education full forward. So, like, I'm proud here of that we're doing it. And like I said, like when I started, I teach African American history. I'm the white elephant in the room. I always joke around with that with my kids. And I feel that's so important that when that came through, it put it into words for people. And like you said, not enough are doing it. And I'm hoping that people could take a lesson from what we do here and learn how to bring that forward.
Yes, it's very important. It's very important that people have the full richness of the American historical experience. And it makes us better people. Yeah. It makes us wiser, and it makes us more understanding. Yeah. And it helps us to make the right decisions.
Well, you mentioned truth, right? And I think how important is that? And you have so many people fighting the truth.
Right.
I have a sign in my room. It says, "I teach hard history."
Right.
I teach it because it's the right thing to do. You don't want people to not know the truth, because when you go 10 years, 15, 20 years outside of your education and you find something, you're like, why? Why didn't I know that? And I don't want that to happen. And as for you, what you do, that enlightens people to understand it. It's the whole point when you brought up 1619 Project.
Right.
Educating the truth. And so then we look at those pieces in Black History Month and obviously it getting passed and making sure legislated. You mentioned Amistad. So Juneteenth, we start here in New Jersey. Governor Murphy says it's going to be a state holiday. We're going to have state recognition, and then the country moves on that.
That's right.
So what are you feeling about our state moving in that direction first, and then we get the national?
This is how most reforms happen. They happen at the state level, and then they happen at the national. Like, think about Social Security. There were states that had Social Security before the federal government has it. Like, Roosevelt didn't sit in his office one day, I'm gonna make a new program, it's gonna be called Social Security. No, that's right. There were states that had Social Security. There were states that had unemployment, just like in slavery. Before the Civil War, there were states that had officially ended slavery. And there were a lot of states that didn't. Like New Jersey, didn't end slavery. But that's how reforms happen. They'll happen at the state level, and then they'll go to the national level. Just like with the minimum wage now. New Jersey, there was a big move. The minimum wage is $7.25. That's still the official federal minimum wage in this country. And it's ridiculous. That's a slave wage. You can't pay rent for a single bedroom apartment anywhere in America on a wage of $7.25. So there was a movement called minimum wage, $15 an hour minimum wage. And New Jersey passed that law. A number of other states had passed that law. And the federal government still hasn't passed it. It's still $7. The minimum wage in this country hasn't been raised, I think, since 2009. So inflation has actually put us in a place where the minimum wage today buys less than the minimum wage could in 1967. It's crazy. Like, we don't even ask for $15 anymore, because $15 has not kept pace with inflation. So now what we say, we demand a living wage, that every person that works should make enough money to support themselves and their family. And a living wage would be somewhere like in Essex County, New Jersey, it would be around $33 an hour. That would be a living wage right now. That would be like a floor. And the other thing is, I say to students, you really have to look at other countries. When I went to Princeton and I majored in politics, I also minored in education. Most people don't know I'm a licensed social studies teacher, but I never got into a school, you know, for reasons that may be apparent to some, you know. But I am a licensed social studies teacher, and I'm also certified in African American studies. But in Princeton, if you major in a subject, you have to take a certain core of courses for that subject. And one of the politics we had to take was comparative politics. You had to look at how politics works in other countries. See, we're here, we don't look outside of our borders, and we think that this is the best of all possible worlds. Do you know that the United States, the richest country in the world, has more poor people, percentage-wise, than any of the other 34 industrialized countries in the world today? We have 5% of the world's population and 20% of the world's prisoners. We have more people incarcerated than a greater percentage of our population incarcerated than any other country on the face of the earth. It may be hard to believe, but the United States has more people in its prisons than China, Iraq, and Iran combined. You would think,
Women.
that's right, and a lot of them are women. It's crazy. Like, we don't have, other countries have a living wage. We don't have universal health care. Like, if you go to another country and you say to them, you have a debt to pay from the hospital, they look at you like, what? What is that? Canada, our next door neighbor, Canada, has universal health care. I have a friend that lives in Toronto. He was telling me his wife had a baby. Only thing he had to pay for was the cab to get her to the hospital. And they don't have health, you know, you gotta have health and you gotta say, no. You're a citizen of Canada, everybody's covered, you know. And we should have that here in America. We should have universal health care. We should have free college. Why should students graduate from college with $100,000 of debt for undergraduate school? That used to be the debt you had if you went to law school or medical school. Their kids now graduating. That weight will hold them back. They won't be able to buy a car. They won't be able to buy a house. They won't be able to move out of their parents' house. You know, we have to change that. We need to have free college. We need to abolish student debt. If we have all this money for war, then we should have money to help the people that live in this country. And it's not just help. Wealth is created socially. No one can sit in a room and do enough to make $1 trillion.
Well, so, you talked about war, right? And it reminds me, and I'll bring this to when you were talking about the doors you saw.
Right.
Right. So Tupac said in one of his songs, we have money for wars, but we can't feed the poor.
Right.
On my door, for our classroom, my students, we decided to use the rose egg roof and concrete as the base for our.
There's a rose.
Rose egg roof and concrete.
Right.
No one else thought it would come
Right.
to be. So then it makes me again think back to Juneteenth. Like, we look at that, we have that as a national holiday, and trying to figure out what's our next step. So it's there.
Right. Juneteenth leads us logically to the issue of reparations. Now, what are reparations? Reparations, as you can imagine, comes from the word repair. You repair people for damage that was done to them. In the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan signed a bill for Asian Americans to give, I think, each Asian American family that had a family member incarcerated that is Japanese American, thank you, that was incarcerated during World War II. Most students probably don't even know that during World War II, Japanese Americans who had lived in this country for generations were rounded up and put in concentration camps.
I like you use concentration camp and also incarcerated because they usually get labeled as. Now I just totally lost it.
Right.
I pulled it there, but they don't label it internment.
Internment, but it's concentration camp.
Concentration camps.
Right.
They were incarcerated.
Right, that's right. So in the 1980s, there was a law passed that recognized the wrong that was done to the Japanese Americans, and many of them, their property was confiscated without their knowledge, literally just taken away from them. Many of them had farms and properties. You know, the prime farmland in California was made that way by Japanese Americans living there. All their property that was taken, so they had to be compensated. So I think it was like $20,000 for every family member that had been incarcerated. So
The official apology.
an official apology. Right, so we have Juneteenth, but there has never been an official government apology for the enslavement of black people in this country for 400 years in North America and 245 years in the recognized American colonies. Never been an official apology from the government, and there's never been reparations. Now, here's where the idea of reparations comes from. The idea that people should be repaired is an ancient idea. In warfare, conquered peoples were sometimes repaired for damage that was done to them. Most of the time, the repair came in the form of land. Land was given. So when it became clear to the white population that slavery was wrong, and when some of them realized something had to be done to repair, General Sherman, during the Civil War, he went south. This is one of the reasons why there's such deep hatred for Sherman in the South. He issued General Order Number 15 in January of 1865, I believe, which confiscated 400,000 acres of slave masters' land, and he gave it to the enslaved people. He said, you worked this land for generations. With the price of, the price of treason, the price of insurrection. We're expropriating, we're taking the land from the slave masters, and we're giving that land to the enslaved. He took 400,000 acres in the South, I believe the South Carolina, Georgia area, and distribute that land to the enslaved. On the basis of General Order Number 15, Thaddeus Stevens introduces a bill in Congress, H.R. 29, which said that every formerly enslaved person or the survivor of one who fought in the Civil War would receive 40 acres and $50. People say 40 acres and a mule, but the mule wasn't in the bill. It was 40 acres and $50. The mule came from the fact that when Sherman expropriated the land, if you didn't have an ox or a mule or a beast of burden to pull a plow, you couldn't really do nothing with the land. So what happened was the mules that would pull cannons, sometimes they were given to the formerly enslaved people so that they would have a beast to help them plow that land. But Thaddeus Stevens said 40 acres and $50. That bill was introduced. It was initially passed in the House, but then what happened? Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, I believe April the 9th, 1865. Lincoln was assassinated. Lincoln's vice president was Andrew Johnson, who was from Tennessee, which was, he was a Southern sympathizer. He actually sympathized with the slave masters. So all that land that Sherman gave to the slaves, Johnson wrote executive orders that land had to be returned. And then the HR 29 was never passed in Congress. So it was reintroduced in 1989 by former Congressman, now deceased Congressman John Conyers. And there's an HR 49 reparations bill in Congress today to create a study commission to come up with reparations proposals for the descendants of people that were enslaved in this country.
It just reminds me again of what's happening right now, because in New Jersey, we still haven't even changed our constitution to outlaw slavery. And that's, Senator Rice came on with it, Assemblywoman McKnight came on to it, so hopefully we can get that moving. Even it might be for some people just words, but
Right.
for others,
Right.
it's monumentous considering New Jersey's history.
Right. Well, there's another aspect to this too, and that is the fact that when the 13th Amendment was passed, it abolished chattel slavery for everyone except those convicted of a crime.
Correct.
So people who are in prison today in the United States are in essence slaves, and they are worked like slaves. Many corporations have availed themselves of slave labor. Everybody got a car? Everybody got license plates? Those license plates are made by prisoners who work for nearly nothing. I think, though, that there's a prison wage, which I think is something like 35 cents an hour. It is some minuscule amount of money. So there's but it's slave. What what can you do with 35 cents an hour? If it was $1 an hour, what could you do with you know?
Worst prisons in the United States.
Angola, Louisiana. Yep. But so there's a movement now across the country to change the 13th Amendment to eliminate this thing. And many Fortune 500 corporations, are in these prisoners are doing telemarketing. They're doing all kind of. They're building furniture for some companies, and it's a form of slavery, and it needs to stop.
So you've offered so many great nuggets of wisdom and history. Again, it's like being in my classroom. So I love this, and it's, I know the students out there who are going to see this are going to love it. So I'm going to end it with this. If you could visit, and then you're going to visit a lot of our classrooms here.
Okay.
Film. If you could visit every classroom in the United States, what would you say to those students in those classrooms?
Well, the first thing I would say is to take care of yourself. To take care of yourself, to eat right, to get enough sleep, to get exercise. You got to take care of your body. You only get one, and when you're young, you feel invincible, you feel strong, but as you grow older, you become more vulnerable to sickness and disease. So taking care of yourself, your mental health, your physical health, this is very important. I know you thought I was going to tell them something political first. No, the first thing is take care of yourself. You don't have to be, if you can go jogging, go jogging. If you're not jogging, go walking. If you don't want to walk, do exercise, but do something. Atrophy is death. A sedentary existence is the way to an early grave.
Don't take care of yourself. You cannot take care of it.
That's right. Leave them cigarettes alone. Leave them drugs alone. Leave alcohol alone. I forgot who said it, but all things in moderation. You do anything to extreme. Even a runner knows if you run too much, you hurt yourself. You run yourself into the ground. You have to modulate your activity, whatever you do, but take care of yourself. Take care of your physical health, your mental health. And then the second thing I would say to young people, especially those that are in school right now, we have a Dr. King holiday. We have a Dr. King monument. We have schools named after Dr. King. We have streets named after Dr. King. But most students don't know what Dr. King fought for. Dr. King didn't just give the I Have a Dream speech. He wrote 6 books: Measure of a Man, Stride Toward Freedom, Strength to Love, Why We Can't Wait, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, and Trumpet of Conscience. I would say you shouldn't graduate high school and not have read at least one of Dr. King's books. And if you had to start somewhere, I would say start with Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community. And I guarantee you, when you read that book, you will find it very relevant to what's going on, because of all the things Dr. King fought for, the only area that he really had, well, there were 2 areas that he had success with. One was the abolition of the segregationist laws, the racial segregation laws, and 2, the passage of the voting rights laws. But everything else Dr. King was fighting for is still with us today. Poverty is still with us today. War is still with us today. Deprivation, inequality, even racial segregation. Even though Dr. King was successful in getting the laws of racial segregation abolished, we are actually, as a nation, more racially segregated today than we were in 1968 when Dr. King was assassinated. And the racial segregation is actually greater in the North today than in the South. So the fight continues, and I would say to young people, get involved with an organization. First of all, start with your own organization. I got involved in the struggle through my student council. Make the student council relevant. Bring up issues in the student council that affect students today that they're concerned about. You know, make that student council an activist student council. Start there, and then join other organizations in your community. Like, every community has a branch of the NAACP, and there are other organizations. You could join our organization, People's Organization for Progress. But join an organization, make an existing organization, an activist organization, or join an organization or create an organization that will try to make this a better country. This is a great country. America is a great country. No ifs, ands, and buts about it. It is a great country. I'm born here. I'm an American. I don't want to go anywhere else. But we can be a greater country. We don't have to just settle with great. We can be greater, you know, and we have the capacity. See, this is why Dr. King was so optimistic, not from just idealism, but because we actually have the capacity, the technological capacity, the resource capacity to eliminate these problems. Almost all the problems we face today can be solved, and we have the tools to solve them. What we lack is the political will and the determination to solve them. But I know that the young people, if they rise up and they get involved, this thing will change, because it always does. When the young people get on the move, things change.
You look at any of the great revolutions that have taken place, they've been led by young people.
That's right.
They are the ones who are the movers, the shakers. They are the ones shifting the focus.
Yes.
Mr. Hamm,
Thank you.
I got to say,
Thank you.
absolute pleasure